Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here and honored to be here at my alma mater, Georgetown. I was just reflecting, and it struck me that I believe it was 21 years ago this week that I was defending my dissertation just across the way in Healy Hall, I believe it was. So it's wonderful to be back, and I'm very pleased and honored to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm going to do three things tonight. Since this is an academic setting, I have really three goals. One is fairly abstract. I want to talk about the meaning of the left-right political spectrum. Does that even have any significance today? I'm going to argue it does, but I want to talk about how, and I think it may be different from the way some people think about it. Secondly, I want to talk about liberalism and conservatism as these terms are used today, and talk about why they're misleading labels, and in fact they're labels that are freighted with such conflicting and contradictory notions and meanings that they're opposed philosophies, and yet it isn't clear on which grounds they're opposed. So more about that shortly. Finally, I want to talk about political centrism. What do centrists believe? Why political centrism? Somebody, a populist activist politician, actually, Jim Hightower, once said that that the only thing in the middle of the road are yellow lines and dead armadillos. My hope tonight is to try to defend a different view, to show that centrism does have a substance, a content. There is a principled centrism, and so I hope in the third part of the talk to do a little bit of that. Let me begin, though, because I think it's a fascinating story, to talk a little bit about the idea of political left and right. Why do we use these terms? Where do these labels really come from? Well, the labels come from, interestingly enough, from the French Revolution, from the French National Assembly of 1789. It was at that assembly, which really ushered in the French Revolution, where these labels, left and right, begin to be used. And in fact, the left, or at the left, were seated the delegates and representatives of those who were representing the common people. Today, people that we'd refer to as the liberals and Democrats, more or less. At the right were seated the delegates representing the interests of the church and the aristocracy. They took the right. And ever since that time, we've sort of used this label, left and right, to capture a distinction, a political distinction, but it isn't exactly clear what this distinction is. And I want to talk a little bit about that tonight. It's interesting. The left-right political spectrum, as we tend to think about it today, we tend to imagine at the left anarchism, and then perhaps Marxism, and then various forms of Western-style socialism, and then liberalism and conservatism and authoritarian theories, and maybe at the far right, Nazi, fascism of various forms, including Nazism. I mean, that's the sort of the traditional idea of the political left-right spectrum. What does that gauge? What does it measure? Well, it's interesting. In the 1820s and 30s, maybe a generation after the French Revolution, we begin really to see for the first time the use of the labels liberal and conservative. Well, conservative had been used before, but modestly. But liberal and conservative began to be used as political labels, and indeed as labels that represented opposing positions, beginning in the 20s and 1820s and 1830s. In the United States, it probably took an extra 10 years. It really began in Britain in the 1820s or so. We see the formation of the Conservative Party in Britain in the early 1830s, and it's at that point really that the two camps, so to speak, begin to sort of represent in some way opposed ideologies. But what are the ideologies? A little bit more about that momentarily. What's interesting is how the political spectrum sort of fills out in the next 50 or 60 years. by the 1820s and 30s and 40s, we begin to see the elaboration of essentially theories to the left of liberalism. We begin to see socialist theories defended. It was in 1848 when the young Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, and we begin to see Marxist themes develop. So as these themes sort of develop and in essence push the political spectrum leftward, liberalism sort of gets relegated to an almost middle-of-the-road or reactionary sort of theory, at least from the standpoint of the left. From the standpoint of socialists and rigorous Marxists, the critique of liberalism was always essentially that liberalism doesn't go anywhere near far enough, that it, as Marx put it, it liberates the state, it liberates politics, but it doesn't go deep enough. It doesn't liberate society. It doesn't serve to liberate the individual from oppressive social and economic influences. So liberalism begins to take on sort of the tenor of a middle-of-the-road theory, if you will. By the late 19th century, you begin to see the development of a kind of a counter-reaction. You begin to see the development of what we might call proto-fascist theories, and theories that ultimately led to the rise of Italian fascism, Mussolini's fascism in 1922. But these theories, in a sense, began to push the sort of the contours of the spectrum further to the right. Conservatism is no longer sort of the right-wing theory, as it were. We have these theories further to the right, which are in some sense, for some reason, which I want to explore in a minute, more right-wing. So you begin to see the filling out of the spectrum. But the question is, well, what does the spectrum really mean? What does it really mean to be politically left or right? People have disagreed about this. Political theorists have different theories about it, and there's a kind of a lively debate, at least among academics, or what academics would consider a lively debate. What I want to suggest is that what really underlies what I'm going to call the progressive vision, the left-wing vision in its various manifestations, is something that really did begin to emerge in the French Revolution. And in particular, it was the philosopher Condorcet, who himself was ultimately a victim of the French Revolution. But Condorcet wrote a fascinating book called A Historical Sketch of the Progress of the Human Mind. And in that book, he really begins to talk about what he thinks the vision of politics ought to be from this point on. It's significant that we're at the point we're talking about the Enlightenment. We're talking about a period in late 18th century history where the old order is breaking down. The old natural law order, the sort of the synthesis of Aristotelian and Christian philosophy, which had really existed for something close to 1,500 years, really breaks down in the late 17th and 18th century. And so it's really literally by the point of the French Revolution when it becomes apparent that a new ideology new theories are going to emerge to sort of take its place. What is the progressive vision? Well, Condorcet in his book says that the real vision of politics ought to be, in fact he calls it the final end of the social art, ought to be the pursuit of what he calls a real equality. And what he means by a real equality is actually a pretty breathtaking concept. What he means is that equality embodies not simply a sort of overcoming of political differences or social or economic differences. It's a much more all-embracing idea than this. Condorcet ultimately argues that real equality is an overcoming of all of the types of differences that ultimately result in economic, social, political differences between individuals. But his theory is that government ultimately ought to go so far as even to overcome the differences of the natural or genetic lottery, that government, in essence, the role of government is really, in essence, to overcome not simply the effects of society, politics, the economy, all of these sort of extrinsic differences that have always put different individuals in different places.